I'm going to start where I left off yesterday evening, talking about yellow rattle seeds. This is what I was bringing along. And I think it's kind of relevant to our presentation because yellow rattle is a very unusual plant. A single plant flowers and will produce thousands of seeds. And usually in nature they get lost in the wilderness, you know. But if you collect them, like I probably have a couple of hundred seeds, if you collect them and if you prepare the ground and if you know about what that seed is looking for, so it takes time over winter, it needs a bit of cold, and then in the spring it'll grow, and every one seed will produce thousands of seeds. And if you collect those, you can spread them out again and again. But in nature, they will just grow by themselves. And I think just to remind you that what they're going to do is they're going to take a monoculture grass, a grassland, and transform it into a biodiverse wilderness if it's managed properly. And I think our role is to do that facilitation and that management, so to speak. So today what we're looking for, we've got one seed that Mike is going to talk to you about. It's a kind of a small flower, and we know there are lots of flowers in the room here. And between the three of us, Mike and David, we're going to go through, if you like, first of all, a story. Some of you have heard some of the story already because this is the third time that we've presented to Metaphorum. Third time we've talked anyway. But we've grown a lot on the way, and more recently we've been talking to John and Angela. And in fact, our objective today, and we have specific objectives, we'd like to come away from here with some, at least the roots of an action, or more seeds, or even flowers that have already started to grow. And then, and we also want to get your feedback on the specific flower that we have here. We love that. So we're dividing this up into three parts. David is going to speak about our story so far. So how we started off 20 years ago and bring you right up to today. And then Mike is going to talk about a specific project that we think is quite relevant. It's only one example, and what I saw this morning, there are many examples of things going on. But what we really want to look at from, I suppose, from a systems point of view or a cybernetics point of view, is how can we use that to transform society? And that's the rebooting into another system. So like our yellow rattle, we're going to transform one system into another one. I'm going to hand over to David and tell us your story.
Our story, yeah. So this is not an academic exercise. I mean, this is, I would say, this is actually research. But essentially, the roots of it, this project, if you like, were that some of us involved in setting up the organisation European Health Futures Forum have been working in the health systems for a long time, and we've been involved in organisational change, so we have some expertise in that area. This is mostly in the UK, but also in Netherlands, in one or two other parts of Europe. What we realised after some years was that our attempts to bring about change produced microscopic effects. And we tried to understand this by stepping outside of the system a little bit. One of the things we did, we had a meeting, we had regular meetings in the summer, we call them summer camps. But this was a particular one we held looking at an idea we had, which was of changing the quality of healthcare in a society by getting business and education to work together with health. So in other words, to try and get rid of the silos a little bit, or at least explore why this wasn't happening. And one of the things we did was to get some dialogues going between people to understand what the cultural, if these were tribal issues, what were the cultural differences? What we discovered, perhaps not surprisingly, I think this has really already been touched on this morning, is that people in society, in Europe generally, have lost their way, in the sense that the value systems which originally underpinned healthcare, the delivery of business, delivery of education, had been severely eroded, so that in fact the whole notion of caring in health had turned simply into target management. In business, the notion of giving back to society had somehow been lost. It had simply become a kind of a gizmo, a rush after profit. And in education, instead of educating the whole person, it becomes simply a way of getting qualifications. Now, this we thought was extremely interesting. But the problem then remains, what do you do about it? Because this is then this vast problem about the nature of society. So how do you tackle it? So again, trying to step outside of the box, we looked at futures thinking as a way of maybe going from outside to see how things could be helped to change. Everyone agreed that things needed to be changed. It's very striking in health, which I know best, for example, at the highest level, the European Commission and so on, the policy people there know that the current system is not sustainable. And you don't have to go into the detail, it's a given. And yet no one knows how to do anything about it, because huge systems like this are self-sustaining. And the problem is, to operate an alternative model involves a kind of double running, which no one is prepared to fund or to take the risk on. The risks are seen as too great. And yet we know that the risk of simply falling over the cliff is even greater, but no one's prepared to take that risk. And of course then there are all kinds of political issues, the nature of sacred cows and so on and so forth, which are impediments to the necessary change. So one of the things then that, I'm just checking on the time.
You've got 5 minutes.
Yeah, one of the things that we started to think about was alternative models which involve bottom-up. So again, and this has been discussed already this morning, the question of how much you balance top-down from bottom-up and so on. But what we were interested in was the complexity science and what that teaches us about emergence. And we also, because we are horizon scanning as part of a futures-based organisation, we were seeing that there are all kinds of fascinating things going on in small areas in different countries. There's, for example, a fascinating group of people called Incredible Edible that are growing vegetables in public spaces. And yet, when we went to Ireland and talked to them over there about it, there was maybe 2 or 3 people doing it, and they weren't talking to the people in England and so on and so forth. And there are other things, again, it's something I only know at second hand, but I need to study more. In fact, we're in Utrecht 2 weeks' time talking to a whole load of people who are doing community-based stuff related to healthcare, which has emerged spontaneously because people are totally pissed off with the current system, and are also very much into self-help. And it's also, for example, I'll give another example, in a smallish town in Somerset, in the southwest of England, there's a city-wide scenario where people are trying to tackle loneliness by public cooperation. Now, what fascinates us is, and again, this is the question has already been posed this morning, is what are the situational criteria which facilitate these kinds of things to emerge? But we were also interested in the whole question of how you can harness the power of individual small projects and make them have more leverage for the total system. We're well aware that there's a real danger in terms of sizes of organisation that beyond a certain size, and again we studied this politically and otherwise, that democracy goes out of the window because it then becomes about power and so on. And so it's a very difficult balance to see how this can work. But the things we thought were really interesting was to tackle the question at the lower level of how to get people to collaborate and not see other activities that are going on elsewhere in other communities as either being not relevant or a potential threat to autonomy. And in a way, that's kind of where we're at. The fact is, like the whole enterprise that we embarked in 10 years ago, we had no idea how we were going to do what we were going to do. we've got together about a community of 100 thinkers and doers, you know, who are loosely associated in a network with the organisation. And one of the things we've been struggling with is how to mobilise that power in terms of getting them to, because they're also damn busy. You know, I mean, they really subscribe to the concept and they're loyal, you know, in terms of they keep coming back and they come to meetings, but they're so busy we can't use their potential in the way that might be possible. So there are all these kind of conundrums, you know, but what we felt we learned from the last time we presented here was using VSM type concepts. That maybe instead of looking to expand our organisation, really at this point we should be looking to collaborate. So again, at another level, walking the talk, you know, just the sort of thing we're trying to do. So one of the things that we have come back this year to after that message in Dusseldorf last year was, well, let's see what EHRF and Metaphorum might do together to tackle a problem we both saw as very real. And what would that look like, that project of working together?
I just add two very small things to what David has said. One is that while we're focusing on healthcare, I've been involved in education and I know of initiatives in education, and the kind, we could say almost exactly the same about the educational system. You could say the same about the food system. You know, you could say the same about a whole range of different systems, about the energy system, about the monetary system, about all the systems which are going on. And there are initiatives sprouting up in different ways. That's one thing. And then the only other thing was, and it was an insight that we got, and it was partially linked into the VSM model, was this whole definition of the environment within which we operate. And we started to call it the context. So, and we said that we're not really suffering the environment. We don't see ourselves as being, looking at how, to a certain extent, we live in this environment. But we want to change the context within which we're living. So in order for a number of these initiatives to prosper, they need to recreate or to create a new, and it's a little bit like the Control-Alt-Delete. We kind of mistakenly said, and I fell for that trap, you push the buttons but you're back to the same system, you know? Yeah. So you need to know how to, you know, get in there and stop the computer going up that route and give it another route to go up, basically. And that's really, to a certain extent, this metaphor of the context, you know? Anyway, then really to make the point. So we're currently studying examples, as I was giving some, of how bottom-up activity is happening, and obviously there's nothing like a direct case example, and that's what Mike is bringing to us.
Thank you. You see, I've got my two gurus. The rest is just pragmatic. Okay, it's nothing more than that. I'm a doctor by background. This is my 40th year in the health service, so the marks on the back, as they say. What I'd like to tell you about in a second or two is a thing called care rooms, and the inadvertent success of it being about how bottom-up occurred despite the model that we actually did. And I think it's important to realise that some side effects are not bad ones. And you know, if you look through the history of pharma, you'll see that various drugs came to the fore by accident and serendipity. So I guess this is in that category. I work as an independent health consultant these days, running my own business now. I also help the new medical schools, and I'd love to be able to talk to you about why I think that's important about the curriculum and what we should be doing with it in terms of systemising health, but that's for another day. But I also work with a thing called the Clinical Entrepreneur Programme, which was set up by the NHS, run by a really dynamic guy called Tony Young, about 4 years ago, and I've been working with a group of entrepreneurs and founders of other companies, one of which is a guy called Paul Godin, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. Now, he's an engineer by background, and like all engineers, he's got a system in mind and he has a process in mind, and he really does push that to make sure it happens. And he's done it several times in different companies, including selling bagels to the English, which was a major achievement. Bagels are not bread, you know, But he basically, I'll tell the story of Paul's journey in this because it's important. His father had severe Parkinson's disease, and they lived out just north of Cambridge, and father stayed with his mother throughout just about the whole of his last few years, and they adapted the house. So the downstairs they had an ensuite, there was mobility, machinery, etc. when he got very severely affected. And of course, about 5 years ago, his father died, and this facility was still there. And Paul thought his mother wanted to basically redecorate it, put it back in as a living room. He said, no, we could use this facility as a community asset. And that reminded me of the work of McKnight in America about how you use the assets of a community to enhance it. And he decided to, and I remember he floated this past me through someone else, and he wanted to call it Airbnb. And basically that you would have a platform where you could match these facilities to people who would have had them in their home and would have thought about just replacing them, and pay them an honorarium to bed and breakfast people. And the imperative for this was, the other side of this coin, is that health services are overwhelmed and we continue to operate the same model. And that model is one that is doctor-centric, clinician-centric and not patient-centric. An interesting survey of chief execs about 3 years ago that I was part of asked if there was one, and these hospital chief execs asked one question, if there was one thing you could change to help the access problem to care, what would it be? And their answer was uniformly loneliness. Because the number of people they saw who were in hospital inappropriately at the end of their lives, and I do quite a lot of work on mortality reviews, so I see this acutely, that about 30% of people who die in hospital probably should have died at home and should never have been in the first place. About another 40%, if given a choice, would probably have stayed at home as well, in that group that are coming through. So he designed the system to democratise these rooms, and it's under a commercial basis. We have to apply for seed funding and things like this. We have a board. And what we did then was recruit people to run, and they may not all be in their own personal homes, they may be in somebody else's home and running it for them, or they may in fact be in nursing homes. There's no reason why it can't occur anywhere. And the big win for the health service was this is a damn sight cheaper than sending somebody to an acute facility which is costing you $500, $600 a day. So there was a buy-in economically. But what we didn't realise was what would happen next. And what happened next was that when these people went into other people's homes, they weren't treated as a patient, they were treated as a guest. And as a guest, you wanted to do something that you would do for your own mother or father or child. So, in other words, it wasn't the care became a host and guest, and then it became a friend and friend, and they became concerned about what happened next. They also wanted to know, if that person had another episode, will I always get that person if I've got the facility for continuity? And they also wanted to know, who else in my community is doing this, so that we can form a network. And that added a strength that we never thought would occur. And much as probably the name David Cameron doesn't probably have a good connotation on this side of the water, but one of the things he talked about was big society. I don't actually think he knew this is what he meant by it. But I think we're demonstrating here what is the potential of democratising that. Because what these people have shown is leadership at a very granular and, in your view, autonomous system. And I don't know much about your VSM. VSM, yesterday to me, meant very senior manager. And that's a pay scale issue. But now I have a viable system in my head, and you've got the 5, yeah, I can learn a bit quickly. And at the present, the health service is stuck in 1 to 3. It's a here and now, and it doesn't know how to change. And I don't think we're any different, to be honest with you, than many other mature health systems, because their structure is such that it keeps supporting the same. So the Royal College of Medical Academies in London will not give way on what people do, which we used to condemn in Dockers in Liverpool. There's been a demarcation dispute, and I still think that we need as professions to look and say, what else can people do to skill up? Because Mark Britnell's book recently, Mark Britnell wrote a book called Human, which is around the workforce crisis. He's visited 60 different health economies across the world. And he estimates somewhere between 13 and 20 million short of health professionals in the world. Actually, that's probably a really underestimate, because I think in India they've got 3 to 4 million. So it strikes me what we define as it depends on how complex your system is that you're speaking to. But whatever it is, it's a big number. And no matter how many more nursing skills, medical skills you have, you are not going to deal with that. So you have to mobilise the population to do other things. And some of that will be done altruistically, some of it needs financial support, and some of it needs, I think, to be systemised. And I think, from what I've heard, what you all do in your various jobs and the way you work, and I was amazed that anybody could write a book that's 875 pages long on such a thing. I'll do my best. It strikes that there are things that you could bring that are not the usual management consultant speak that you will get from KPMG, PwC and all that, who'll come and give you what I would regard as a generic form of change. Because although that's a community we've dealt with, if you're talking about a homeless community, you might want to do something different for that, or with that community, as a bottom-up approach about what their healthcare needs. And I know people have started to do that in various cities, including Boston. I think I'll stop there, because that's as much as the actual project is going. We want an academic partner with us now to start looking at how you might report this effectively. And we also want to expand the model so that we're not just seeing, what is the first flush of success in anything where you've got enthusiasts. Thank you.
So just to come back to the main aim here for this session is obviously to share this with you, but really to ask you for help in how we might put together a collaborative project.
Great, and we're going to try to do that in 2 ways. One is we're just going to have some feedback or questions or clarification, and then probably that'll take, we have 10 minutes to go, that's the way I reckon it. But we'd really like, because that's going to probably be dominated by a few conversations, so we'd like to get feedback from as many people as possible. So I'm going to give out post-it notes. The question is more important than the answer, as you all know from one certain Deming gentleman. So you may have questions, and we'd not just respect it, but we'd encourage the questions, but we'd love to know your reflections on what you've just heard as well. If you have suggestions or potential my rattle seeds, if you have some seeds that are very similar to what Mike has described, or if you have advice for us, we love that as well. So if you could put one idea on each post-it, that would be great. So while I'm giving these out, you can start clarifying or asking questions.
Is it okay if I intervene a little bit?
Absolutely, please do. Away you go.
Tomorrow I'll present, I'll discuss with you the reviewing process. But I would like all of the authors, if they decide to actively participate, basically by putting your papers, your presentations on review by the rest of the participants. If you feel comfortable.
I have a presentation, but it wasn't appropriate for this sort of way of doing it.
And let's organize that. And I really like the initiative.
Any comments?
There's a project There's a project I'm currently involved with. I live in an old textile valley in Yorkshire. Two very, very tight, strong Yorkshire communities, 3 miles apart, and there's still antagonism between the two, although to me they seem exactly the same. There's a crisis, as you know, in England there's a crisis in care for old and disabled people, and it's a major problem. And about a year ago, a group of us got together to look into setting up a cooperative in one small community, which is rooted in the community. So the people who are employed live in the community. It's a multi-stakeholder co-op, so it's owned by the carers and by the people who they're caring for and their relatives and anybody else who wants to get involved. So it's a multi-stakeholder, community-based co-op. And it's going to be small. It's going to be 10 to 12 people, so it can be self-organising. And we just put forward this idea, and we found that the people were banging on our door and our email boxes were jamming up, and there's this real crisis. And we got as much interest from the people who needed the care as we did from the people who were providing the care, who were all working in these terrible profit-orientated companies and having a terrible time and working 18 hours a day and hating every minute of it. And also from the local council, who said, this is fantastic because we are just not delivering what needs to be delivered. And all the way around, there was this huge enthusiasm for it. And the council just started giving us money and saying, you know, can we give you money to help with this? And we were all a bit taken back, because this is just an idea, you know, it's a bunch like this, putting forward this idea. And then the carers started getting involved. We got a woman who was very senior executive in the care industry, who lives locally, who said, I've been waiting forever for this is just fantastic. And this thing's going ahead, and it's probably going to launch in the next few months. And the model we have, to answer the question that you asked earlier, is that the metaphor that was being presented is that of a strawberry patch. So that we set up this first strawberry plant and we get that working properly. And then that sends out runners to the next community and the next community. And then we set up another 3 or 4 in the same valley. And then we see what happens. So you keep them small, independent, community-based cooperatives. And then you work on collaboration and building the meta-systems to bring these together. So you can do more and more and more and get all the economies of scale and all the collaborative advantages of a large organisation, but always small, rooted in the community. And I think this model of small community-based co-ops that network and gradually extend like the strawberries and gradually take over the whole world. You know, the strawberries will cover everything. We'll be a strawberry-covered planet. So this is where we're going. And obviously, you know, we haven't launched this thing yet. So hopefully next year I'll be able to come back and present the progress of how we've gone. But as a concept, I think it's very sound. And the other thing I wanted to mention at this time was I read a book by a guy called Jeremy Rifkin. And he says that the model for everything that's happening at the moment is the same as the way that knowledge changed from the old system to the internet. And the old system was you had experts who wrote books and we just became passive consumers of knowledge. And now everybody contributes and everybody's interacting all the time. We're all providers and consumers and producers. And I think that's the way everything's going to go. And he talks very well about energy. But energy used to be big companies and then this hierarchical pyramidal structure. And if you look at energy, we've all got panels in our roofs and small micro hydro. And everything's changing away from these large pyramidal structures to these collaborative networks. And his argument is the future's going like that, which may or may not be true, but certainly as a model, I think it's very, very attractive.
But there's a very similar model to that in East London, where a guy called Sam Everett, who's a GP there, a leader in BMA. And this started because they have very poor outcomes for chronic disease. Thank you. Very poor outcomes for chronic disease. And so they worked together and formed a cooperative. And they got lots of businesses to actually partner with them to finance it.
Wonderful.
And some of those businesses thrived on the back of it. Now, I've updated that project for a couple of years, but it was very successful. And for their diabetes program, for instance, there was a paper produced called Smelling the Petunias. They have a garden there. And the idea was that you shared your experiences in the garden with people who were developing personal improvement plans for their diabetes. Because most people go to diabetic clinics and they're given a diet, and they're given an insulin if they're on an insulin prescription, or they're given some of the pharma, and they're expected to go away and do it. You know, whereas a collaboration actually does that.
Great, yeah. I'm just going to say we're half an hour is just way too short. And Angela did mention that there may be a possibility for for working on some topics tomorrow, I think. Yeah. So it might be worthwhile just to, I don't know if you want to put a comment on your post-it or not, whether you might be interested in any way. We haven't talked about the theory, we haven't talked about, well, we've done a lot of work on empowerment, patient empowerment, professional empowerment, the empowerment through e-health and so on. There's a lot going on just in health, and all of that's also going on in education and in other areas. But there's I think a wonderful possibility for linking the brain power in this room with some of these initiatives, and being, as my metaphor with the rattle seed, if you understand it and if you can kind of nurture it, then you can change the whole system. You can totally change things.
We are changing the system. It's happening right here now. I'm very positive. I'm very optimistic.
Okay.
For the Netherlands, I'm very optimistic.
Yes. Excellent. We take one. Yes, Gary.
You've been there.
First of all, that was very inspiring. Thank you for that. I would really like to work with you guys. I hope we have a chance to talk about that. My talk first thing in the morning, our platform might be really good for you as a place to hold your discussions. And just as a sort of overall model for change, quite unlike the control elite. The model that I like best is a sort of metamorphosis model. You have the new growing and developing within the old, and gradually building a coherence within it and taking over as it obviously works. So the caterpillar with its chrysalis, the caterpillar dissolving, and the butterfly developing within it. So it's not a revolution. It is a reboot, but it's a metamorphosis. It is growing within you within the old.
There are several questions coming now. I want to attempt to answer this. One of them is a comment, and I think that there are strands of this that are going on in other countries as well, where changes occurring around the articulation of self-care and patient-centeredness. Or, to be honest, I hate the word patient-centeredness. It's citizen-centered development. But the one that says cure, care, well-being, happiness, and more becoming equal, I think what you're really saying there is the outcomes that we use tend to be pretty prosaic ones. They're usually ones that describe what a medical outcome is, not what an outcome is for somebody who's receiving at the receiving end. And we have to change the language, because if you're 88 and living alone, yes, you want your respiratory symptom to improve, but actually most of what you want to improve has nothing to do with that. So measuring the expectation about what is happiness is a good idea.
Just a very short comment. I work with Samaritans in the UK, and a lot of the calls are isolation. They're just isolation and deadly. And just being able to speak to one person once a week and still feel like the same thing, it's absolutely good.
You have to stop.
Okay.
So hopefully we'll meet with some of you again to talk about this further tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Great. And if you wouldn't mind bringing up your post-its so that we can collect them.